Good afternoon, good morning, and on behalf of the USTTI, Packet Clearinghouse, and AFRINIC, I want to welcome you to this morning's webinar discussing internet infrastructure in times of crisis. We are thrilled to have you with us today to joining this discussion and to hear from the experiences of Bill Woodcock and the team at Packet Clearinghouse. Several weeks ago, the USTTI, AFRINIC, and Packet Clearinghouse came together to discuss the ways in which we could bring our strengths to bear to ensure that the training that all three organizations prioritized throughout the year was able to be delivered during these unusual times. As a result, the work that has gone in over the last several days and weeks to develop and produce the session you will see today has been significant. I want to thank my colleagues from both AFRINIC and Packet Clearinghouse for the commitment they've made to bringing us together today and to ensuring that we will have a robust and insightful discussion. I want to introduce specifically from Packet Clearinghouse's Executive Director, Bill Woodcock, and Nishal Gobardhan, who will be joining us today. From AFRINIC, Mr. Bashir Angode and Willie Manga have worked tirelessly in the last several days to ensure that we are here and prepared to deliver today's session for you. It is great to see all of you logging in, leaving comments, and being with us today. I want to introduce and turn it over and thank Mr. Bill Woodcock, Executive Director of Packet Clearinghouse, for being with us today and for all of the work he has done to ensure we will have a robust discussion this afternoon. Bill, welcome, and thank you again very much.
Thanks very much, Jim, and welcome everyone. I'm going to spend a little bit of time here talking about our agenda, and the agenda starts with an overview of internet routing and the domain name system, and we'll talk a little bit about the critical points there. Then we're going to move on to an overview of the DNS topology and the critical points there. We're going to talk a bit about a recent I'm going to summarize a recent paper by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which provides sort of technical and economic guidance to government on policymaking. And then we'll talk a bit about some of the expert recommendations that didn't make it into that paper. Then we'll move on to a Q&A period. Overall, we're looking at 2 hours here. So we'll try and spend roughly a half an hour on each of these 4 sections, including the poll. And then in the Q&A, I'm expecting that we may take a bit more time on that. So I'm willing to stay on, and Nishal is willing to stay on, and Jim's willing to stay on and talk about any of these issues for as long as the questions remain. So we'll have 2 hours of content and then an open-ended discussion until we're exhausted. And then, as Jim said, we will send out the slides and the video or post them. And I'm hoping to also do a little bit of a write-up that might get out next week based on the results of the poll. So the intention here is really to have something interactive where you'll get something back from this conversation next week. We're also looking at continuing this as a series so that in the future, every 2 weeks or so, we may pull together another one of these. It depends really upon what you're interested in. So we're very interested to hear what topics you'd like covered in more detail. And I'll move ahead to the next slide, overview of internet routing and points of criticality. the important thing about the internet is that it's a network of networks. It's a whole lot of different independent networks that are all connected to each other. That means each one has its own governance. Each one has its own technical mechanisms and products being used and protocols and so forth. The thing that they all have in common is the internet protocol. That's what ties them together. Now, the networks are referred to as autonomous systems. And if you've been paying attention in your AFRINIC meetings, you'll know that autonomous system numbers are the unique serial numbers that identify each of these networks. Now, the thing about the internet as a whole is it's huge and complicated, but it's made up of these pieces, of these individual networks, each one of which is, not necessarily hugely complicated. And there are really only 4 stages of growth that those go through. And so if you understand what those 4 stages are, you'll understand the internet. So I'm going to run through those really quickly because from a policy perspective, understanding what stages of growth different networks are in is really important to understanding what kind of support they need to continue growing. Also, these 4 stages of networks interconnect in only 2 ways, peering and transit. And peering and transit have very different characteristics also. Transit you pay for, peering you're doing yourself. And so from an economic perspective, you really, really want to be doing as much peering as possible. So we're going to cover those 2 as well. So next slide. So this first phase, and I'm sorry, many of you have probably seen these slides before, but we'll get on through them relatively quickly, is an internet service provider that is selling transit to customers. Those are the folks below that cloud, and they're buying transit from an internet service provider above them. That's the arrow going up. These arrows are showing what direction money is flowing. And that transit provider above them may be participating in an internet exchange point. The next stage of growth is to connect to multiple upstream transit providers. So as an internet service provider grows, they need redundancy, they need connections that won't go down at the same time. And there's topological redundancy as well. They need to be connected to networks that have different strengths and weaknesses in terms of what they connect to. The third stage is peering at an internet exchange point. So this horizontal connection out of this ISP network is showing a connection to an internet exchange point where bandwidth does not cost money. Bandwidth only connects you to other networks that are connected to that exchange point, but it doesn't have a unit cost. You have your own costs involved in connecting to the exchange, but no unit costs for additional bandwidth after that. So this makes for a really big change in the economics of internet service providers. Once you have peering, your business model is basically defined by how much bandwidth you can move through peering rather than through transit, because the transit has an incremental cost, the peering does not. So the next stage after that is simply connecting to multiple internet exchange points. So what you should be gathering from this is that internet exchange points are very, very important to the internet service provider industry. When you don't have internet exchange points locally, your bandwidth is being produced in internet exchange points further away. Speed times distance equals cost. So the further away the internet exchange points where your bandwidth is coming from, the more expensive it's going to be and the slower it is. So this is why so many of us will tell you that you need to be paying very close attention to the health of the internet exchange points in your country or the ones that you're dependent upon. So I'm going to show what it looks like to put together an internet out of these building blocks. The stage 1 networks, the stage 2 networks, the stage 3 networks, the stage 4 networks, and the internet exchange points. first of all, we've got transit. That's the red arrows here. The stage 1 networks each have one transit provider. The stage 2 networks each have two transit providers. The stage 3 and 4 networks each have 2 or more transit providers. Then we add in peering, which is these green lines connecting the stage 3 and stage 4 networks to the stage 3 networks to one internet exchange point each, and the stage 4 networks to 2 or more internet exchange points each. Then all of these networks have customers. Those are the little blobs with a C in them. So if we pick 2 customers and say we want to see how traffic moves between them, each of those customers is connected to an internet service provider. The one on the left here will trace the packet going from it to the one on the right. It's going to send its packet to its service provider, who in turn sends it up to its transit provider, who's going to go looking for an exchange point that they can offload that packet to another transit provider, down through a stage 3 provider to a stage 2 provider, and onto that customer. So we've traced a path through the internet. No packet ever travels through more than one internet exchange point, right? So the internet exchange point is the point where the value is being produced. It's sort of like no banana ever goes through more than one farm, right? You never take it back to a farm. It's always going from the farm to the person who's going to eat it. So what you see here is that there's an ecosystem in which the internet exchange point is where the bandwidth is being produced, and there's a hierarchy of internet service providers connected to those exchange points that transport the bandwidth from the IXP to the customers, where the customers can use that bandwidth. Where are internet exchange points? They're all over the world. There are about 600 internet exchange points in the world now. But what you'll see on this slide is that they're really concentrated in developed countries, in countries where there is business being done and money being spent. And for instance, there are none in Alaska or northern Canada. There are none in the center of Australia. That's because there are no people there. There's no money being transacted there. You'll also see that, particularly in northern and central Africa, they're fairly sparse in Africa, as they are in Central Asia. So that means that bandwidth that's used in parts of Africa that are distant from exchange points is going to be more expensive, and it's going to be slower. It's also going to be more fragile. That connection is dependent on international connection, bandwidth, to bring it in, international fiber, to bring it in, worst case satellite. So if we're in a time of scarcity and things are already expensive and difficult, making sure that these fragile connections are not overused and that the connections that are most likely to go down are not the ones that you're most dependent on, are a sort of prioritization that you need to do. There's also, correlation does not equal causation, understood. But here's the correlation between GDP per capita of countries and exchange points. The height there is GDP per capita, and it's just sorted. So what you see there is that there are a lot of countries that still don't have exchange points. This slide is about 2 years old, so a few of the ones on the right have moved over into the left. But the wealth being generated in countries with exchange points is much greater. As the internet becomes more and more central to business and education, having internet bandwidth that is inexpensive and readily available makes a bigger and bigger difference, just as roads do and a healthcare system does, and so forth. So access to internet exchange points, competition between ISPs to carry bandwidth from those exchange points to customers, rich interconnection of the internet service providers within the country between each other. These are all things that make the network in your country more robust. There are also things that can be influenced through governmental policy. For instance, one of the problems that some countries face is that there is a dominant incumbent network operator and they refuse to peer inside the country. They say, well, everyone else in our country should be our customer, and therefore we will not connect settlement free with anyone else inside our country. If they want to connect with us, they have to go somewhere else to do it. And by the way, we have a monopoly on those international circuits, so they'll be paying us one way or other. This is a problem, for instance, in Canada. In Canada, Bell Canada is in that position. Bell Canada peers at 7 internet exchange points, none of them in Canada. You need to meet Bell Canada in the United States if you want to peer with them. So that means that other internet service providers in Canada are forced to take Canadian domestic traffic, move it over the border into the United States, and then back again. So that is a problem that can be dealt with through regulation. So let's move on to the poll. The AFRINIC folks have kindly set up a poll. You'll see a URL at the top of the screen here, http://menti.com, MENTI.com. It'll ask you for a code to put in. The code is 964791, and then you'll be able to walk through these questions that you may be seeing on your screen right now. There we go. So this first question, does your country have at least one internet exchange point already? There are a few countries like the United States, Brazil, Russia, that have many dozens of internet exchange points in every major city. There are a few countries, as you saw in that earlier slide, that don't have an exchange point at all yet. So the ones that don't are at a severe disadvantage relative to ones that do, because they can be cut off from them. They can be cut off either in an absolute sense or just in an economic sense. It may be that their currency will become devalued at some point, and the cost to move traffic from another country may become prohibitively high. So getting internet exchange points into all of your major cities is a great goal. Making sure you have at least one is a very high priority, and getting your internet service providers to connect to them is a very high priority. I'm going to let this run for a couple more moments while we get a few more people answering the survey. So let's move on to the next question then. The next question is, are all of your major network operators peering at the IXP? In small countries, it's often possible to get to a point where the answer here is yes. You know, a lot of the Caribbean island countries, everyone peers. A lot of the Pacific island countries, everyone peers, because there may only be 3 or 4 networks. It's not difficult to sort of collect the whole set. Obviously, on day one, only a couple of them will be participating, but then you get to a bit more growth, and it may be possible to get all of them participating. Then, as you grow larger and larger, the complete set becomes harder and harder to collect. So taking Australia as an example, there are no internet exchange points where all the Australian ISPs participate. First of all, Australia is a big country, and there are a lot of small ISPs that are only in some places. But also there are big incumbents that refuse to peer. So the important thing here is that there be a way of delivering traffic to every destination in the country without sending it to another country. So if you've got multiple internet exchange points, you don't need every ISP to participate at every exchange point. You just need a relatively high degree of overlap so that there will be some place where any two ISPs can exchange traffic. Let's move on to the next question, which is, do you have multiple fiber cables on diverse paths connecting your country to the rest of the world? So not all traffic can be delivered through domestic internet exchange points. Your local traffic, the traffic between people inside your country, can be, but that's not all of it, right? You've got international traffic to other countries that has to come in somehow. It's got to come in through a cable. Now, if you have one cable and that cable breaks, you've got a problem. If you are landlocked and you are dependent upon your neighbors for connectivity, then those connections are subject to political disruption as well as economic disruption and technical disruption. And that makes the internet a high diplomatic priority. So that's a position that you want to avoid if you can. Now, the way to solve this, of course, is just run more cables. Cables are expensive, but there are other people who are running cables, and you may be able to convince them to run those cables through your country or past your country. And you have domestic industry. You have people inside your country who may be interested in running cables who could be encouraged or subsidized. Okay, next
Bill,
question.
we have in the question and answer section, a question somewhat similar to what we're discussing now. And it's from Hussein Badran from Egypt. And he says, I run a national IXP in Egypt, the only one. Would it be a good practice to charge the ISPs connecting to this IXP? The charge is thought to be a percentage of the exchange traffic per year, he says. That way, I guarantee a governmental income for the service of saving international traffic for these ISPs.
Yeah, so this is actually a fairly common question and an area of sort of interest by a lot of governments. Obviously, anytime you see an area of business prospering, as a government, you need to figure out how to make some of that go to pay for the costs of government. And the problem here is that you don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. So the internet exchange point is what's producing the bandwidth, but then the bandwidth is being consumed by people, and those people are paying. Now, the policy question here is, do you tax production or do you tax consumption? And my argument is that you would definitely want, in this case, to tax consumption, not production. You want there to be as much as possible, and you want it to be as cheap and as available as possible. Therefore, you want people to be able to produce it in effectively unlimited quantities and distribute it to people who use it and charge those people for that use. And then you want to take income tax from the companies that are doing that work and that business. You want a sales tax, an income tax, something at the point of consumption rather than the point of production. The problem with utilization-based charging at an exchange point is it discourages the production of bandwidth, which is exactly the opposite of what you want to do. And in this case, what would happen is you would place this tax, this charge, upon the users in Cairo, and they would just start another exchange point that didn't have that tax, right? That was in Alexandria or was elsewhere in Cairo, or worse, was in a different country, right? Because internet exchange points, by and large, do not charge fees, and essentially no internet exchange points, no internet exchange point that has ever succeeded has charged a utilization-based fee. So you really want to avoid that. Doing that would kill your exchange point because it would drive people away. Now, the goal of funding governmental operation, of course, is a priority for everyone. So by all means, income taxes on ISPs are a very reasonable, normal way to do that. Now, should the internet be specially taxed? Should the internet be taxed at a higher rate than other industries? That again is a policy question. My answer would probably be no, and that the income tax that applies to internet service providers would presumably be the same as the income tax that applies to bakers or car manufacturers or sellers of toys or whatever. So then it's just a question of whether your general tax collection mechanisms are appropriate. If the ISPs are doing well, if the internet industry is doing well, it'll generate a lot of revenue, and that'll all be taxable revenue. So let's go on to the next question. Is there competitive access to domestic and international cables? So the question here is, let's say you've got cables coming into your country, but both of them are owned by major carriers, and those carriers do not compete they do not allow competition on those cables from their own competitors. So they may compete with each other, but a third party would not be able to buy capacity on those cables to use to compete with the owner of the cable. So this is a step that many countries go through, where they've got their first cable, but somebody monopolizes that cable, and so they don't really get the benefit of that. Many of you in Africa probably remember a period when the SAT3 cable was really the only option for fiber, and it was only available on the West Coast, but the price of it was just a tiny, tiny bit less than the price of satellite. It only had to compete with satellite, not with other cable operators. And so the benefit was minimal until there was real competition. So the OECD's job is to sort of analyze this kind of economic issue. And in the telecommunications space, what you often hear them say is that there isn't any benefit from competition until there are at least 4 parties competing on a sort of apples to apples basis. So making sure that there's competitive access, that anyone who wants to can buy capacity at competitive prices on whatever cables you have is a huge step towards getting your industry functioning well and resiliently. Let's move on to the last question of this bunch. Is it regulatorily possible for all network operators to deploy new fiber to customers and between points of presence? So there are 2 ways that fiber gets laid. It can either be by individual license, where someone who wants to run fiber needs to get a license, and there are often some fixed number of licenses available. This is the way it's often done in the mobile wireless space, because the amount of radio frequency spectrum available is limited. The other way of doing it is the way most ISPs are licensed, where if you want to start an ISP, you go and you start your ISP, but you have to follow certain rules. You're a member of a class that have to follow those rules. And that may involve paying a licensing fee and so forth, but there is not some fixed number of licenses that you have to compete for. So when there is a scarce common good that has to be apportioned in a way that benefits the public, then individual licenses make sense. When you want as many people as possible to go out and do the work to make the world a better place, you really want a class license. So the putting fiber under your streets or on your telephone poles is, I would say, closer to a class license kind of situation, where you really want people to go out and make that investment and do the work than it is to a scarce common resource like radio frequency spectrum is. But there's only so much area under the street. There are only so many times you want to dig up the street. All of that requires some coordination. All right, let's move on to the DNS. If you have additional questions, Jim and Nishal will be trying to deal with questions as they come in, and we'll have time at the end to do some discussion. I'm going to move a little bit more quickly on the DNS. Let's go back to the slides now. There are three major areas, assuming that the internet is working and the packets are flowing. You need to be able to find things on the internet. You need to be able to type in an email address, type in a URL, and get to the thing that you want to reach. Now, the DNS is what turns those names into the numbers that your computer uses. And the DNS is made up of a bunch of different parts. Now, I don't have a bunch of slides on this, so I will cover this a little bit more quickly. USTTI offers longer classes on this, and when people are not locked down because of a virus, we'll undoubtedly return to that kind of format, or we can have a more topical workshop just on that topic later. And so the root name servers are the top of the name distribution hierarchy. When somebody wants to resolve a .ao name, the root name server is going to point them at name servers for Angola, right? Just as when somebody wants to resolve a .eg name, the root name servers are going to point them at an Egyptian name server. Without the root, everyone would have to know where all of these servers are. Just as without a .eg name server, everyone would have to know where all of the servers within .eg were. So we have this hierarchy through which queries get distributed to the parties that are able to answer them. The root name servers distribute to the top level name servers. The top level name servers distribute to second level name servers. And the second level name servers are the ones typically that belong to individual companies or government ministries or universities or whatever. Recursive name servers sit in between the users and all of those root and top and second level authoritative name servers. A name server that has an answer is an authoritative name server. A user who wants to get an answer can either go and mess with all of those authoritative name servers to try and find their answer, or they can go to something called a recursive name server that will then go and do that for them and will cache the answer. When it finds the answer, it'll keep a copy of it so that the next person who comes to ask the same question doesn't have to wait while that recursion process is undertaken. So these are sort of the top of the DNS infrastructure and the part that policy should apply to. Root name servers historically were all operated by United States organizations because historically there was a time when the entire internet did not extend beyond the United States. Gradually over time, some of those root name servers were transferred to other administrations. The Japanese government operates one, RIPE, the European equivalent of AFRINIC, operates one, and the Swedish government operates one. The remainder is still operated by US organizations. Now, you'll notice none of those are in the global south, and those haven't changed in quite some time either. So there was a period through the 1990s when it was seen as a goal to move administration of root name servers out of the United States. One of the things that changed that, changed it for the better, that was Anycast. So originally there were just 13 root name servers, and so who controlled them sort of governed where they were placed. now you can have as many root name servers as you want associated with each of those 13 administrative domains. So some of those 13 still only have a small handful of servers. Others have many, many hundreds. So in total, there are a couple thousand root name servers now distributed around the world. So it doesn't matter quite so much who administers them, because there's very little leeway for administrative policy making around root name servers. They're all supposed to be operated in exactly the same way. Now, what that leaves you with is not the question of whether you're going to get control of administrative control of one of those 13, because there are very few. And obviously not everybody is going to get one. And that fight is not very active right now. If somebody else were to get one, for instance, the Brazilian CGI, the Comité Gestor do Internet, which does a really good job, and they really understand DNS well, and Brazil is a big country in the global south, they might be a reasonable party to get one. But every country can't have one if there are only 13. But again, that's only the administrative control. What's really interesting here is just whether you have the servers themselves. Now, when PCH does a deployment, when we deploy at an exchange point, we're generally bringing root name servers with us. Generally, we're bringing droot and eroot. Those are the two root name servers that are administered by the University of Maryland and NASA. So it doesn't matter whose administration those are. As long as they are local to you, you can get an answer from them locally. But it's also the case that you can just get the same data that those root name servers have. And more people are looking at just keeping a copy of that data locally so that they don't need to go out to root name servers. Now, that works fine as long as you are good at running DNS equipment and you can keep your copy up to date and synchronized. Top level name servers, these are like the country code, the ccTLDs, the country code top level domain servers. But they're also top level domains in Arabic, for instance, using a different script. Those are called IDN TLDs, internationalized domain name top level domains. There are also ones for individual cities and regions. And there are ones for cultural groups. There are also ones for brands. Sony has their own. General Motors has their own. Fiat has their own. So there are many different kinds of top-level domains. There are about 2,000 of them overall, of which about 200, 10% are country code domains. The important thing is that the ones that people are using most have servers that are local to you, and the ones that people in your country are using most have some kind of legal responsibility to the population being served. So an example of an area that's a little bit problematic is the Philippines. The .ph top-level domain is privately administered, but the guy who runs it does so as a business, and he's very concerned that the Philippine government will not treat him fairly, and so his business is not incorporated in the Philippines. The problem is that that means that not only do Philippine taxes not apply to him, but also Philippine courts and laws don't apply to him. That's a tricky problem when a government is trying to keep their laws and judicial practice up to date with the internet. If everybody is using domains that are not responsible to the courts in that country, you've got a bit of a problem. It can go the other way also. There are repressive governments where people need to discuss civil rights and voting and so forth, and they don't want to do so in a domain that is controlled by that government. So, you know, there are arguments in both directions there, but probably the answer is to have diverse practices where rule of law is reasonable and reasonably applied. Recursive name servers are tricky. And as you may know, if you've talked with either me or Nishal or any of the other people at PCH or Quad 9, there's a problem with recursive name servers, which is that somebody figured out quite a long time ago that if you could see all the DNS queries coming through, you could tell what people were doing on the internet. And in this century, a lot of money on the internet, most money on the internet perhaps, is made by selling information about users. And so there are companies that already know a lot about what you do. Companies like Google that have your search history. There are companies that see your email. There are companies that see your web browsing. All of those pieces of information are typically for sale one way or the other. And that's really detrimental to privacy. So many countries have a data protection officer or a privacy regulator who's responsible for looking out for the interests of the citizens of that country and protecting their privacy. Recursive name servers have mostly been operated on a for-profit basis from the United States, regardless of where the servers actually are. The jurisdiction that they're responsible to is the United States. Now, unlike many countries, the United States does not have a data protection officer, does not have a privacy regulator, and doesn't really have many laws protecting anybody's privacy. So if you were a company that wanted to make money selling information about people, you would probably headquarter yourself in the United States, where the law is very, very friendly to that kind of operation. You would not headquarter yourself in Europe, where the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, gives fairly broad protections to people in the handling of their personal information. So we got a recursive name server going that is not for profit, that does not collect information. That's Quad 9. And we deploy those, like we deploy root name servers everywhere where we put equipment out. It's our hope that other recursive name server operators will spring up, as there are many root name server operators who are non-commercial, and will provide privacy respecting service. But until that happens, this is an area where there is definitely room for governmental policy. And Canada is an example of that. In Canada, the Canadian government and I believe the UK government has done the same thing now. They have set up recursive name servers that are sort of domestic in nature. They're well positioned throughout the country. They do not sell information. They are supported by government funds. And they work pretty well for people in those countries. There would be no reason for anyone outside of those countries to use those, right? You wouldn't use a Canadian server if you were in Tanzania, right? Because then all your queries would be going halfway around the world and they'd be subject to Canadian law rather than Tanzanian law. So that's sort of the parts and pieces that are at play in the DNS. And again, like getting all of your ISPs peering, the important thing here is to collect the whole set. You want some root name servers, you want all the TLDs that you care about, and you want some recursive name servers to all be available at your exchange points inside your country on an equal basis, so that all of the people using the internet in your country will be able to get at them without shipping data outside the country, outside the data protection regime that your country offers. So let's move on to the questions now. The first question, does your country have policy and operational control of its TLD? Again, if you go back to menti.com, we should have these questions up. So the question here is policy control over the TLD means that the administrative contact for your country code top level domain is probably your communications ministry, or it might be a private party inside your country, or it might be a university, but someone subject to law in your country. There are a lot of country code domains that were essentially ripped off by private for-profit companies early on. They went to the IANA, which at that time was just one guy, John Postel, and said, hey, you know, we'd love to do something great for, well, Kenya was in that boat. So the .ke domain until about 2001 or 2002 was operated from the United States. That became problematic. Businesses in Kenya wanted to register more domains. There just wasn't a path to get that done quickly and efficiently. So Kenya set up KENIC, and they got the .ke domain redelegated back into the country, made either KENIC, or I'd have to go look whether it's KENIC or the Kenyan Communication Ministry, the administrative contact for the domain. Operational control is who's responsible for making the servers go. That's of far less importance because whoever has the administrative control can tell the technical contact what to do or can select another technical contact. But it is important that the servers exist in your country and that they be operated to the benefit of people in your country. There are places like Tuvalu has the .tv domain, and they get a lot of foreign revenue by selling .tv domains to television stations all over the world. So they have a different priority there, but still they don't have another country code domain for their people to actually use. So they need to focus on both. But for most countries, focusing on the domestic issues is what's important. Let's move on to the next question. Do you have root servers and public recursive servers in country? So the rootservers.org has a map that shows where most root name servers are. So this is something, if you don't know the answer, you can go and check it. Most internet exchange points have a root name server hosted there, but not all, certainly. Internet exchange points and data centers are the place to put them. Let's see. I think my questions have gotten unsynchronized with the ones that are on the screen now. So yes, let's go with what you're actually looking at and voting on. Are ccTLD operations maintained inside your country or outsourced? So this question is about whether, let's say that you're, right, this is about the technical contact for the domain. My apologies. So in a lot of countries, there will be technical experts inside the country that will take care of running the name servers and doing the registry function. And then other countries, they will hire a company to do it. Now, the communications ministry in this case would be the customer, and they would contract with a company to do it on their behalf. So they're still in control, but they're paying money, so money's leaving the country, and they're not developing the technical expertise within the country to do it. You've seen a bit of a struggle with the country Colombia, the .co domain, over the last decade or so. It was being operated inside the country, and then some people thought, well, you know, CO is almost like com. So we think we could sell a lot of domains outside the country, but we don't really have a lot of expertise on how to do that. So let's outsource that. they went to a company called Newstar, which did an outstanding job of it, sold a lot of .co domains, brought a lot of money into the country, but at the same time, all the technical operations went to Washington, D.C., right? So people in Columbia no longer had something to work with that mattered, that they could be learning on. So anyway, okay, let's move on to the next question. Do you have root name servers in country? Sorry, this was what I was talking about earlier when I didn't realize that I had gotten out of sync with the slides. So again, root name servers will typically be in internet exchange points or at data centers. Getting a root server deployed in your country, you may wind up having to pay some of the costs of making that happen because there's no commercial model around root name server operation. There's no profit being made by root server operators by operating them, so the cost of deploying them winds up having to be covered from other sources, grants or donations or other businesses that they're operating, or by local hosts. Next question. Do you have public recursive servers in country? So Google has 8.8.8.8. Quad 9, of course, is 9.9.9.9. Cloudflare is 1.1.1.1. There are a bunch of different ones like that. There are also ones operated by Network Solutions and the TWNIC, the Taiwanese NIC. There is Cisco's OpenDNS. So some of these get fairly widely distributed. Others, are only in places where they can sort of make the most money. Again, there's a balance to be had here. You want these to be local, and you want them to be well operated, and you want them to be sensitive to the privacy of your citizens and responsive to your local policy and jurisdiction. So you're probably not going to get all of those things. There are going to be some trade-offs here. And also, this may not really be entirely under your control as a government. You could specifically outlaw some practices. You could specifically approach some recursive operators and try and get them to deploy. But, in larger countries, over the span of time, what's going to happen is going to happen. Some will get deployed, some will get pulled out, and you just want to make sure that there are some good options for people in your country. All right, let's move on to the next section, talking about the OECD paper. This came out, the OECD normally produces papers that are maybe 75 to 200 pages, take about 2 years to produce, lots and lots of input from different sources, and kind of slow to make them happen, and a long process to get them declassified. At the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, the OECD kind of switched gears. They said, what will be most useful for the world is not if we produce a bunch of papers 2 years from now saying what we think about pandemics, but instead, if we try and get things onto a 2-week time frame. So they, as I said, kind of switched gears and produced a whole bunch of papers about different things, agriculture, transportation, whatever, but also on the internet and how to keep the internet working and what was happening. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see the URL for that paper. It was published back in April and then updated once. So the current version went up on May 4. Again, you probably don't want to have to copy that URL off the screen, but the slides will get distributed, and if you just search for OECD keeping the internet up and running, you'll get to that. So let's walk through their major findings in that paper. Next slide. The first one, since the start of the COVID-19 crisis, demand for broadband communications has soared, with some operators experiencing as much as a 60% increase in internet traffic compared to before the crisis. So that was basically looking at March and April numbers. What I think a lot of internet network operators found is that they experienced sort of 6 to 8 months worth of growth over the period of 2 months. People who had been working in an office went home and started video conferencing from home. That replaced face-to-face interaction that didn't take any bandwidth. So there was a big increase, but also the traffic patterns changed. Whereas before, businesses tended to have bidirectional traffic, and residential users tended to have inbound traffic primarily. They were downloading things. Now suddenly, home users were behaving like business users and were using traffic bidirectionally. Now, we can talk more about that. The next section, there's actually a bit more about that. So another thing to understand here is that this growth is not being provided just in time. The internet providers, it takes 18 months to get new fiber deployed, new equipment deployed. So anything that was deployed in January 2020 had been getting built since July of 2018. Right? Anything that's happening new during the pandemic isn't for use now, it's for use next year. So there's this sort of slow feedback loop here, which means that if an internet service provider tells you, oh, we're responding to the pandemic by deploying a lot more equipment or by deploying new fiber, that's not true. Right? During the pandemic, everybody's getting less done. It's harder to deploy people in the field. Logistics are more difficult. Travel is more difficult. The supply chain is screwed up. It's difficult to get the equipment you need. Not as many people can go into buildings at the same time to work. There are many, many problems that are slowing things down. But the effect of that is not going to be felt right now. The effect of that is going to be felt in 2021. Right? So there will come a time when we will see hampered growth, but that is not right now. Right now, what's happening is that stuff that was planned for and built over the last year and a half is getting used at a faster rate than it would have otherwise, right? So there's always headroom in the system. There has to be, because of DDoS attacks, because denial of service attacks use a lot of bandwidth, far more than people doing video conferencing. So if you've built a network, you planned it out, a year and a half ago, and you build it, and now there's a pandemic, and people want to use more bandwidth, what they're competing with is those DDoS attacks. They're using capacity that you build out in advance that would have gotten used by DDoS attacks, but was getting used to fulfill actual growth now instead of actual growth in 6 months or 8 months from now. The assumption here being that you're continuing to build more on top to accommodate ever larger DDoS attacks and future growth. And that's the problem. That's what's not happening so much right now. Let's go ahead to the next slide. Okay, additional short-term measures are important to further enhance network stability. ensuring access for network operators and content providers to communication equipment, data centers, and mobility of technicians to customers' homes. So what this is saying is that there's sort of two classes of work that need to be done. One is the routine work that is accommodating next year's need, and the other is something breaks and has to be fixed. Right? So we all recognize that we're gonna hit a bottleneck next year when work didn't get done right now. But stuff still breaks and has to be fixed. So an important policy consideration is that internet service provider employees be treated as critical in the same way that ambulance drivers and so forth. If our economy is depending upon people's ability to work from home and not go into an office and get sick, then we need them to be able to work. And so when something breaks, we need people to be able to go out and fix that. That means those people need to be exempt from travel restrictions. They also need, and this is all stuff that mattered a lot more, a month, 2 months ago when everyone was still under lockdown. Some countries are starting to come back out from under lockdown now, so this is not so much of an issue. But in the general case, it's something you want to be thinking about as a policy consideration, that if you're dependent upon people being able to work from home, you need the maintenance of the infrastructure to support that to also be possible, and that means not locking down the people who do it. It also means keeping supply chain open so that the tools and parts and pieces that they need to fix things are continuously available to them. Next slide. Policymakers and regulators can alleviate congestion in mobile networks by releasing additional spectrum on a temporary basis. So the idea here is that there are transactions that are awaiting regulatory approval, and there is spectrum that is not deployed, and regulators could temporarily release that or provisionally release that to mobile network operators who are prepared to use it in order that they have more capacity to support mobile users. The important thing here is that those shortcuts not be enshrined into permanency, right? If you temporarily loan your incumbent a bunch of additional radio spectrum, they're of course not going to want to give it back because it's a valuable resource, but that temporary loan didn't face the same competition and regulatory scrutiny that it would have in another day. And so the important thing here is that you not hamper competition and disadvantage competitive operators in the name of efficiency during the pandemic. But getting the spectrum out there and into use is a good thing. Next slide. Deploy more fiber deeper into networks and phase out DSL. And alleviate administrative burdens to use network deployment. So there are a couple things being said here, and they're kind of tied together. Let's start at the back, the administrative burdens. In order to run fiber, typically you need to go and get permits from the city to dig up the street, or permits from whoever controls the telephone poles to hang more stuff on the poles. Those permits are often fairly difficult to get in a bureaucratic sense, especially when you're trying to get them in many, many municipalities at the same time. And those municipalities have slightly different processes and so forth. So what's important here is to streamline the process and make sure that municipalities still have control over city planning, obviously, but do not have gratuitously baroque processes that have to be learned by ISPs who are trying to get fiber in the ground. Now, the getting fiber in the ground, fiber is how bandwidth gets moved. Copper is not. Copper used to be, but we're essentially 20 years past that. Major data centers no longer even support copper. So if you have ISPs who are telling you DSL is important and we need to continue investing in it and spending money on keeping it going and so forth, they are essentially creating artificial scarcity. That's not a legitimate argument to make. Instead, what they need to be doing is getting as much fiber in the ground as possible. The fiber will carry billions of times more information than the copper. So once you have fiber, as long as there is competitive access to it, there will not be scarcity. More strands is always better because it makes it easier to divide that up. Now, we have the next set of poll questions here. Why don't we switch to the Menti again for the
and
poll.
Bill, as we go to Menti to answer the poll questions, one of the questions in the Q&A section from Suryan Ba in the Gambia is, considering the lockdown during the pandemic and where to deploy additional infrastructure, has the OECD report discussed anything on the use of satellite for broadband?
It doesn't, because the satellite is sort of in the same realm as copper in terms of the amount of bandwidth that it can carry. It's difficult to get more than about 155 megabits out of a satellite transponder, which is not very much and is sort of in the same realm as the maximum that you can get out of copper, except that the satellite is very expensive and very finicky, and we can't put them up quickly. We can't expand the capacity. And they're also using up RF spectrum in doing that. So satellite is not going to answer your problems. The lead time on putting a satellite up is far greater than the lead time to install more fiber. And it'll be consuming RF spectrum when you do it. So that's why that was not discussed as a serious alternative. Now, on the other hand, you've got things like SpaceX, which is deploying low Earth orbit constellations of satellites that still need to use RF spectrum, but they are much closer, they have lower latency, they can focus on smaller spots on the ground, they can use lower power on both ends. So there are a lot of good things about that relative to geosynchronous or C-band or whatever. But this is, again, a US company benefiting a US billionaire outside of your control, your jurisdiction, and so forth. There are all kinds of collateral issues there, right? Space junk is a real problem. It destroys other satellites. It makes it very dangerous to do work in space, and it makes astronomy really difficult, right? So these are all public goods that are being made secondary to a private good of operating a constellation of satellites for profit. So from a policy perspective, that's not a direction that we want to go, right? We don't want to be using satellite instead of fiber. Fiber is something you can produce in your own country. You can use domestic labor to lay it. You can use domestic labor to operate it. There's not really anything about the fiber that you can't be doing for your own benefit. Whereas depending on satellites, you know, how many countries really have the resources to put up a satellite themselves? I'd say at this point, we've got one country, China, and one company, SpaceX, that can do it by themselves. Everybody else should be thinking of options that benefit themselves more.
And Bill, there was just a follow-up to your comment regarding in the finding in the paper about spectrum. And it is, why are governments releasing this expensive spectrum for free to service providers in order to expand networks during the pandemic, when in fact, network upgrades are not a spontaneous process? And we also know how horrible the supply chain became as part of the question. So just your reaction.
Well, let me tell you a little bit about how the OECD works. The OECD tries very hard to be based on science and rational, logical support for policymaking. But ultimately, as an intergovernmental organization, it's dependent upon its member countries to decide what work gets done, what gets approved, and so forth. Now, some of those countries are the governments are very beholden to their carriers. And those carriers would very much like to have free bandwidth or free RF spectrum. So if, say, Verizon or AT&T goes to the US government and says, hey, we heard there's this paper being written at the OECD, and we think the US government should demand that a finding be included in the paper that governments should give free spectrum to carriers, then somebody from the US government goes trotting over to Paris and says, hey, you should include this paragraph. And then people argue about it, and something happens. And what happened is that we got a paragraph saying that governments should give spectrum, it doesn't say for free, to carriers temporarily, or should approve transactions that were already underway. So this is a compromise outcome in a intergovernmental organization, which is how things get done. I think if you talk with experts, what experts would say is that only some carriers are really in a position to be able to use new RF spectrum quickly and dynamically, and that it doesn't help to give spectrum to anybody who's not in that position, and that there are carefully developed processes already for deciding who gets spectrum. And if you're going to bypass those processes, you should be absolutely ready to roll back those changes and enact your real process as soon as you have the time and attention. So that's sort of how that compromise came to be. Now, one thing I would caution you all is to never get in a position of doing what gets referred to as wireless broadband, right? Never try and use RF spectrum for connecting fixed locations. A fixed location like a house or building, you can run fiber to it, and that creates additional capacity. You need all the RF spectrum you can possibly get your hands on to serve mobile needs. People walking around with phones in their pockets, people in vehicles, right? These you can't run fiber to. So getting more spectrum out there only helps the mobile side. It doesn't help the fixed side, or it shouldn't. If you're trying to use it to serve fixed location users, you're doing it wrong and it's going to hurt. Those ones need fiber. So I would pretty much always prioritize fiber higher, because with more fiber, you can get more cellular BTSs out there. You can go to smaller microcells. You can have people offload onto Wi-Fi. Lots of things work better if you have more fiber. Simply allocating more spectrum doesn't really change the economics of things much. It's just going to steer more money into some pockets and less into others. It doesn't make more pie to go around. Laying more fiber is making more pie. Everybody gets a bigger slice. All right, let's go on to the next question. Has there been communication between policymakers and network operators in your country about decreased bandwidth and decreased resilience in the face of cyber attack? So the question here is, are your policymakers in government talking with your network operators about how fast capacity is being used, how fast excess capacity is being consumed, and how many DDoS attacks are coming in, and who's winning that race, and when is it going to hurt, right? So if you think of this as sort of like a bar chart, we've got one bar there, which is how much is actually being used by real people. and we've got another bar there that is, how much capacity do we have right now? The difference between those two is what I would refer to as excess capacity. It's the capacity that can get used for other purposes like absorbing DDoS, or can get used for growth. Now, how fast you're closing, right? How fast that first bar is approaching the second bar will tell you how long you have before that second bar needs to get bigger, right? So all of this stuff is in motion. And if you're trying to make policy, you need to understand those rates of motion, the relative rates of motion, and sort of projected time to collision, right? How long do we have to solve this problem? And how much worse are things going to get in the meantime? So that communication, government really doesn't have any direct access to those numbers. Only ISPs have direct access to those numbers. Yet the ISPs, they're just trying to do their business day to day. They're not trying to set long-term policy for a country. So this is communication that really, really needs to be happening. Every government has different ways of communicating with the private sector, sometimes through industry associations, sometimes through sectoral advisory bodies, but there needs to be something there, even if it's completely informal, even if it's your communications minister knows people working at each of those ISPs and just calls them up and asks. That's better than nothing. Let's move on to the next question. Okay, so in your country, were private sector network operations staff given emergency worker status during confinement? So if your country locked down, as almost all did, were communications workers in the private sector given an exemption from that? Were they allowed to go get in their trucks and go repair privately owned fiber cables, replace consumer premises equipment, so forth, during the confinement? So this is interesting. We're seeing a lot of yeses here and one no. There are some countries in which this is a policy decision that was made a long time ago, and it just applies during every emergency. There are other places where new laws and restrictions were passed specifically to do with COVID-19, and so new exemptions had to be carved out for those. Okay, let's go to the next question. Has any new radio spectrum been put to use either temporarily or permanently during the crisis? So it may be that not so many of you know the answer to that question for your country. That's going to be a communications regulator question by and large, or a mobile operator. But yeah, I'm really interested to sort of see those answers. This is interesting. A clear majority did put more spectrum into use. This is the kind of thing that governments often don't move very quickly on. So it's neat to see that governments were able to move decisively there. All right, let's go on to the next. Yeah, there we go. Does your country have a timeline and policy position on the phasing out of remaining copper data circuits? So, are permits still being issued for new copper data circuits being laid? Do you have a policy that says that if copper fails, it has to be replaced with fiber? Do you have targets for how many kilometers per year each operator has to replace of copper with fiber? Do you say that new development has to be fiber and not copper? There are a lot of different possible policy positions here, but the important thing is that you do not want money being spent in your country on copper at this point, on keeping it working, on laying new copper, nothing. You want that to be an artifact of the 20th century. So it seems like this is an area where governments have not done a lot of work, and there's a lot of room for improvement here. So that's useful and interesting to know. All right, let's move on to the last section here, expert recommendations and insights. So I was involved with the OECD work on getting this paper out, and there was a lot of stuff that experts said that didn't make it into the final recommendations either because, some government objected, or it was lobbied against, or, there wasn't enough consensus, or whatever. But there are a lot of really good suggestions and interesting observations that didn't make it into that short paper on that short time frame. And so I thought I'd share a few of those with you as well. The first one, and this is a really interesting one for the future of networking, is that this is really the end of enterprise VPN access from home offices. We've got a lot of people working from home offices right now, and the way that used to be facilitated was you'd put a little box in your executive's house, and their home network would become a little extension off of the enterprise network. And so when they connected to their home Wi-Fi, or they used their desktop machine at home, you would have privileged access to, for instance, the mail server at their office. The problem with this is that if they also take their laptop somewhere else and it gets infected, and then they bring it home, they've connected it to a network where it has privileged access to stuff at work, and this provides a backdoor into what would otherwise be a protected network at work. Now, when we were only talking about a handful of senior executives being supported this way, there's a certain amount of pain that people are willing to undertake in order to support those senior executives. But if everybody's working from home, this just doesn't make sense anymore. It doesn't scale. You can't put that much work into cleaning up messes behind everybody. You need a different way of working. And endpoint security is the phrase that a lot of people are using to describe what that looks like. So instead of having network level VPNs, right, a VPN that connects one network to another, instead, security is moving much more onto the devices themselves. So an individual computer might have cryptographic keys on it and be trusted, an individual phone likewise, but the network they connect to would not be trusted. So the good thing about this is that now that executive's home office is no longer a special case. That executive can go into a coffee shop and connect to the Wi-Fi there and have exactly the same kind of access that they would at home or in the office. It does mean a lot more work to secure endpoints, and there are a lot of endpoints, but the endpoints can be treated in a much more uniform way. So this isn't so much something that requires governmental policy change, but it is something that governments like enterprise need to be looking at for their own use, right? So if you're in government and you need, as all governments do, to be able to have private and secure communications, you need to be looking really hard at any VPNs that are allowing home offices and people who are doing work from home, and the backdoors that are occurring now because of massive work from home. Let's go to the next slide. Regulators should no longer allow asymmetric constraint of upstream bandwidth. So this is, you remember I said people went home and video conferenced, and that required outbound upstream direction bandwidth as opposed to inbound downstream direction. This is a historical artifact of cable companies, basically. Cable companies said, well, we've paid licensing fees to Disney for these movies, and now we want to charge people extra for these movies. And if people play games with each other or video chat with each other, or worse, run peer-to-peer file sharing, then we won't be able to make as much extra money from this other unrelated business. Therefore, we're going to constrain the amount of upstream bandwidth and try to force people into patterns of consumption, of consuming downstream bandwidth instead of offering content upstream. This is an artificial thing. Prior to this, the internet was all symmetric. Cable companies, because they're very large, and DSL operators, because they followed in the wake of cable companies, they are large enough customers for equipment that they can just say what equipment they want manufactured, and manufacturers will go out and build it. So if a cable company says, we want equipment that does this, equipment that is inherently asymmetric, then manufacturers will go and build inherently asymmetric equipment that doesn't have as much upstream capacity as downstream capacity. And then the cable operators turn around and say, this is an international global standard implemented by many manufacturers. We're not making a decision here. We're just buying the equipment and installing it the way it was meant to be used. And therefore, you don't get to compete with us on content, right? So this is one of the linchpins of the network neutrality debate. Net neutrality is whether the operator of the network has to treat all content neutrally on a fair and indiscriminate basis, or whether they can prefer some things for money, right? If you operate a network, are you allowed to make one company's content look bad so that customers will go to another company, right? Can you make Yahoo's search engine look good so that Google's search engine will look bad and you can get customers to move from Google to Yahoo, for instance? A lot of people would say that if you are market dominant, you should not be allowed to use that market dominance to create impediments to people in other industries for money. So that's something that was really brought into clear focus because of people's need to work from home and need to do video conferencing. The reason that I am having trouble right now with the video stream out to you guys, the reason why we're running slides off a different machine and I'm not sending video, is because I'm on a DSL connection in France right now, in Brittany. So this is a rural area that has not received a lot of attention. Before the pandemic, I was in Paris. In Paris, I had a 10 gigabit symmetric connection to my house. Here in Brittany, I have a connection that's about 3 megabits up and about, I think, 7 down, which still sounds pretty good compared to a lot of places, but there are also 3 adults here trying to work at the same time using that connection. So it's not good enough fundamentally, whereas in Paris, what we had was really good and it was symmetric. So governments should be looking at that asymmetry and recognizing that any asymmetry is an artificial constraint that is not benefiting users and is actually creating serious problems right now with work from home. Next slide. So it's peering that's producing all the extra bandwidth and satisfying all the new demand. None of that is coming from transit, right? So this harkens back to the question of the gentleman from Egypt about charging for peering, charging for use of IXPs. It's at IXPs, which are not price governed by utilization, that all the flexibility exists to accommodate new demand. So when users want more bandwidth, IXPs can produce that bandwidth, and the constraint is in moving it from the IXP to the user. So what we're really trying to do here is make sure that that's as unconstrained as possible. What that in turn means is that as many users as possible have as short paths as possible to IXPs. And that means that internet service providers need to be connecting directly to IXPs and peering at those IXPs, interconnecting with each other at those IXPs, not just relying on transit. So if you hearken back to the very beginning of our 2 hours, when I talked about those 4 stages of growth, this is saying that ISPs that are in those first 2 stages of growth are not really in a position to be able to respond to changes in demand, such as we're seeing. They can't very well accommodate 60% additional growth in 2 months, whereas ISPs who are connected directly to exchange points, it's no problem. The additional bandwidth flows from the exchange to the user, and the user's need is accommodated. Next slide. So this goes a little bit further than the question about whether private sector communications workers are treated as emergency workers. This is saying what happens when there are too many things breaking and there are not enough private sector workers who are still well enough to go get in a truck and do the work. What happens when those people may be able to get in a truck and go do the work, but there are no parts available to repair things? What happens when our private sector workforce is too constrained? Is there a role for government? Now, this was a suggestion that came from a few of the larger incumbent internet service providers in countries that have historically had very close relationships between government and the communications networks. What they were looking for essentially was use of the military. They were hoping that the military would be mobilized during the crisis to go effect repairs to fiber, to erect new telephone poles where phone poles are blown down, to send air cargo transports, to go collect equipment from manufacturers in China and bring it back into the country, to streamline customs and get the supply chain moving again. So all of these things don't necessarily have to be done by the private sector employees, but it's really difficult to coordinate labor, essentially unskilled labor, if those experts are not the ones doing the work. So this is an interesting area, and it bears thought, particularly because it's something that government can do pretty autonomously, but it's also a very tricky thing. So this is not something to leap in and act without careful consideration and a lot of conversation with the ISPs. Next slide. So the combination of high security jobs being work from home and organizations failing over to overseas cloud services, this is a bit like the issue with the recursive name servers. If it used to be that people in your military went into a closed room and locked the door and had a conversation face to face, and they left their cell phones outside the room, the things that they needed to talk about that required that level of security still have to be dealt with when those people are working from home. But how do we do it? How do we facilitate that if those people are no longer able to meet face to face? We have to have trustworthy tools to facilitate remote working. And right now, those tools are really lacking. This is something that the OECD was looking at doing its own whole separate paper on, workstream on. You've seen a lot of this specifically with Zoom, which we're using right now, and Zoom's interaction with the Chinese government and other governments, and the fact that users do not have control over what path their data takes, or who holds the decryption keys for the data, or even what algorithms are used and who gets to generate the keys. So these are not acceptable risks for government, and they're not acceptable risks for military, and they're not acceptable risks for critical infrastructure operators. Yet the tools that we would use instead don't receive very much support. And there aren't very many of them, and not all niches are filled. Instead, what we've had is a huge growth in cloud services. Cloud services are closed source. They're operating elsewhere in other jurisdictions. They're not responsive to law in your jurisdiction. Their incentives are not the incentives of your users, and they have very little reason to want to protect your users' privacy. So this is an area that needs a lot of attention. And every government should be paying attention to this. Every government should be looking at how its own communications are being facilitated, tracing those paths and saying, how many other people outside our government have access to this information? And assume that if that number is not zero, that information will make its way into the hands of people you wouldn't want to have it, right? Because no other assumption is rational. So many people are incentivized to sell user data now. So many people have built their entire companies around selling user data and are working so hard to lay their hands on more user data just so that they can sell it, that you have to assume that if something is not open source and self-hosted, if that's not an option, that assume the worst, because the worst is usually the case, is where I'm going with that. All right, let's move on to the next poll. Has your government put any special measures or accommodations in place to augment internet infrastructure during the pandemic? So this is, I'll wait for the poll to come up on your screens. There. This first question is a sort of big picture question, and I'm hoping that you'll take the time to write a bit about anything that you have done. We're, I think, wondering whether there are things that we haven't thought of, things the OECD hasn't thought of, that could be fed back to the community as potential best practices or solutions. The help to private sector operators to get their job done in difficult times is obviously a big one. Relaxing constraints that are affecting them, like import duties or travel restrictions, those kinds of things, obviously. All right, well, it's sounding like not so many. And I think maybe we'll continue to solicit ideas from experts and try and get more ideas to you guys that might be actionable. Oh, there's a yes, more fiber optic cables or something are being laid. Excellent. Anything government can do to get more fiber in the ground is a really good sort of medium and long-term solution. It takes too long to be a short-term solution. It's not something that can be up and running in a month or 2 months, but remember that we are going to hit a big, big crunch in 2021 everywhere where work has halted. So, all right, I'll let this run for another moment and then we can move on to the next question and then into general Q&A.
Bill, as that's taking place, one of the other questions in the Q&A section asks if the OECD report indicated the use of universal access service funds as a means of responding to connectivity needs during the pandemic.
I don't remember that being mentioned specifically, and it is a very reasonable question to ask. In case any of you don't know what universal service funds are, this is an idea that dates back to essentially the 1920s, I believe, maybe the 1930s, that regulated monopoly carriers should pay into funds that would be used to ensure universal service. And what universal service meant at that time was farms. You had cities where it was easy to run copper, and you could connect a lot of people pretty quickly and easily, and people had a lot of money. And then you had farms, which were far away and low density, and people didn't have a lot of money. So this is a subsidy from urban users to rural users. The problem is that as more and more of the population has moved from rural to urban situations globally over time, those funds, very little of that money is needed anymore to actually connect farms to the internet. And so people have built huge businesses around diverting those funds and using them for sort of personal enrichment rather than the originally intended purpose. Since we're 100 years on from the originally intended purpose in a lot of places, there isn't much legitimate use still to be had. In addition, farms, if they're all faced with the same challenge, they're businesses, and those are input costs to their business. And if a telephone line cost $1,000 a month rather than $10 a month for a farmer, the extra $990 would just go into the price of a cabbage, right? And the price of a cabbage would go up by 1/10 of a cent or something. So it's not a real problem anymore, yet there's a lot of momentum in this system and a lot of people drawing money out of it. So there's a lot of protection of it globally. And so then the question is, could we repurpose some of that for an actual good use at this point? I would say that in theory, probably so, but that the people drawing from those funds are so entrenched and often have politicians and regulators who control the use of those funds so in their pockets that I'm not hugely optimistic about being able to make a quick change. I mean, obviously a government can look at any pot of money and say, we're going to raid this pot, right? We're going to take money from here and use it for this. Trying to work within the system, though, and use those funds as they were intended at this point, there's 100 years of corruption there that is not going to be overturned just because it would be a good idea. So I think if governments were going to do that, they would have to just act decisively and, raid those pots and use it for specific purposes, not try and tell carriers, oh, you should use universal service money to go deploy new fiber in, places that need it. Because of course they should. They always should have, right? But if it's not getting used for that, it's not getting used for that. And telling them that it should be is not going to change that, unfortunately. So the question that's in front of you right now is, work from home caused your government and critical industries to place new reliance on cloud services hosted overseas or outside of your jurisdiction. This is not a surprising answer, and it's a really unfortunate thing. We're about 2-to-1 answering yes there, meaning that people are using things like Google Docs and Zoom and GoToMeeting and so forth more than they would have before. That also means that more secrets are being shared with more people. And that's happening outside generally of any policy decision to do so, right? So, a British cabinet meeting was held on Zoom, and that made the news because obviously there had been no, national policy decision that cabinet meetings were suddenly going to become public, right? I think because there's a level of opacity in what happens in the internet because of the technology, that a lot of policymakers tend to just throw up their hands and say, well, this is techie nerd stuff and we don't really know what's supposed to happen here, and we'll just trust that somebody else has it, well in hand. And that doesn't go well, because what happens there is not that somebody will have it well in hand, but that someone will say, oh, well, if British cabinet meetings are up for grabs, I'll take that information and I'll sell it to everybody who will pay me for it, which is sort of the worst possible outcome. I think the only real answer to that is that governments, as governments turn over, as new people are hired and they're younger people, there will be more people who have some native proficiency with technology and the internet, and that will help. But these decisions need to be made consciously, and questions need to be asked consciously, and not just sort of skipped ahead. And if the people you're listening to principally are lobbyists and salespeople, you have to remember that they are not acting in the public good. They're acting in the private good, and the government's responsibility is to the public, not to make private parties more wealthy. So I think that, you know, this sort of 2-to-1 is better than I was expecting and hoping. But I think, again, we can do a lot better by looking at open source, by looking at self-hosting, by looking at the technology that you're using and trying to figure out what the risks associated with it are. So, all right. Well, that wraps up the content we had planned, and we are at this point 10 minutes from the end of the 2-hour allotted time. As I said at the beginning, we will spend some time wrapping all of this up with a report back to you guys. But in the meantime, I think we want to run the Q&A for as long as people are interested. I'm very willing to go as long as you guys feel is productive. I'm gonna switch back to my own video here, and if you guys want to try to do the video, I don't know what the quality is like. Obviously I can't see it from here, so we can either do this audio only, or you can, whoever is in charge can try and do the video. Or you can
Bill,
see
you are
Jim's.
back and clear. So you are clear there. We can see you clearly. And
Okay.
want to encourage those with questions, as we've said, as we've progressed through the session, to put those into the Q&A section, and we'll make sure we pull those up for Bill.
So there's one question just forwarded to me. How do regulators get the collaboration of the private sector for the safety of users online? And I think, you know, fundamentally, this is the job of regulators. Regulators represent the public interest, and it's always the job of the regulator to do that in whatever sector or mechanism it's needed. And the tools that regulators have are fees, licenses, prohibitions, rules, penalties. I think a big problem here is the intersection of communications and technology and privacy. And it's very easy for a communications regulator to say, hey, our job is to make sure that people can communicate. And it's very easy for a privacy regulator to say, well, you know, we have these high-minded principles, but we don't have any technical expertise to, you know, evaluate whether they're being followed. And it's easy for an ICT ministry to say, hey, our job is to be cheerleaders and try and get people to use technology as much as possible. And you can see that the question of whether people's privacy is being protected really falls between the cracks there, between those ministries. So I think one of the things that regulators should be doing is looking to each other and trying to clearly establish goals that they have in common and how their areas affect each other. That a communications regulator has to be aware of the privacy implications of the work that they're facilitating. It's not just about getting more fiber in the ground. It's also about whether that fiber is being used to violate people's privacy rights. And if, you know, the fiber is carrying bits, that's great. But if those bits are Facebook, and Facebook is, garnering 95% market share in your country, and Facebook is using that to influence your elections, well, your election monitor or regulator should be interested in that, and that's an area in which the communications regulator and the election monitor need to work together, and the privacy regulator, and the fair trade and truth in advertising regulators need to be looking at the things that happen on the internet. And the communications regulator, in turn, has the mechanism to act on a lot of these things that a lot of these folks don't directly, particularly when the problems they're trying to regulate are problems happening outside the country, right? If Facebook doesn't have a legal handle for you to grab in your country, then you have to address that through the leverage that communications networks themselves offer. Now, the communications networks that are offering services inside your country are, by definition, within your grasp, almost always. There are some exceptions, and those are really problematic exceptions. A big exception is cable and wireless in the Caribbean. Cable and wireless is incorporated in the United States, but has no customers in the United States. 100% of their customers are in the Caribbean countries, yet they don't have the legal handle on them because they're headquartered in the United States. So this is a problem for the Caribbean. African countries, by and large, are larger and don't suffer that particular problem as much, but you still need to make sure that the handle you think you have is actually the one attached to the company and not, a sort of amorphous holding company somewhere that isn't actually going to do your bidding. I remember this was an issue in Mauritius when Mauritius sold Mauritius Telecom to France Telecom and suddenly found that Mauritius Telecom wasn't quite as responsive to governmental requests as they had been before, at least not Mauritian governmental requests. So, next question.
One of the other ones that just came through, Bill, is what other ways could internet infrastructure with the current technology have supported the crisis that has resulted, from the pandemic? So what other way, some use cases, in which internet infrastructure has supported the efforts that have taken place from the
So I think we've got all the pieces we need. It's really a question of prioritizing them, figuring out which ones need to be paid more attention to, which ones need to be taken more seriously. Fiber wherever possible, rather than wireless or copper. That's a big one, because fiber gives you vastly, vastly more capacity, many, many orders of magnitude more capacity. Wireless really needs to be reserved for people who are actually on the move. And, do garage door openers need quite so much? Does the military need quite so much? Is there stuff that's not being used? Is broadcast television not quite so much a thing anymore because so many people are streaming what they want on the internet when they want to watch it rather than, just when it happens to be broadcast? It may be that it's time to do a little shuffling around of licenses and spectrum, but that's not the sort of thing that's going to be a solution to a short-term problem during an emergency. Internet exchange points take a little while to build, so you're not going to be building new exchange points during an emergency, but it's really easy to upgrade capacity at exchange points. Once you've got the fiber in, moving from gigabit to 10 gigabit on a piece of fiber generally means replacing a few $100s worth of equipment at each end. Moving from 10 gigabit to 100 gigabit at this point at exchange points is really only a few tens of thousands of dollars, right? But it's just giving you 90 gigabits of additional capacity. That's a lot. That's a lot of capacity that can be sold to a lot of users. By contrast, if you have to go buy that as transit, it's going to cost you 10 times as much, not a one-time cost of a few tens of thousands of dollars. It's going to be many hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars per month in additional costs. So the difference between being a stage 2 ISP and a stage 3 ISP is huge. So getting as many ISPs as possible up to that stage 3, stage 4 level where they're peering rather than just buying transit, and making sure that they have the ability to lay fiber, the right to lay fiber, the ability to get a class license and dig up the streets and throw fiber in there and light it up. That's really what's going to make the difference. And that additional capacity and resilience will serve you in so many different ways. It's not just going to be useful when you have to lock down because of a virus. It's also going to be useful when there's a physical attack, when you know, bad weather comes and starts knocking things down, when you know, the economy goes to hell in a handbasket and people need to be able to work more efficiently. Pretty much any kind of problem that would face your internet infrastructure or your business infrastructure is going to be alleviated to some degree by having more headroom, more capacity, more fiber, more direct connections, more peering, and none of those are expensive things to do. It's just a matter of changing the way you're looking at it, not wasting as much money on maintaining old stuff and putting more money into laying new fiber and getting it connected. So next question.
And we're back here and with this idea of spectrum and the spectrum that was released. If a country experiences a maximum of 17% increase, is it really a good idea to temporarily assign additional spectrum to mobile operators?
I would say, well, so let's separate the question of how much increase was experienced from how much demand existed, right? So if the reason you had 17% increase was because there was 17% headroom and now you used it all and now there's no more increase because there's nothing to increase into, then yes, by all means, you should be throwing whatever extra capacity you have at that to alleviate that. So the way to figure that out is by looking at utilization curves. So look at the graph of traffic utilization over time, and what you should see is a sort of a sine wave, right? That is peaking in the afternoon, that hits a trough around 4 in the morning, and then hits a peak again around 3 o'clock the next afternoon. And it should be a fairly nice, smooth, continuous curve. I mean, it doesn't look exactly like a sine wave. The pickup in the morning tends to be sharper, and the drop-off in the evening tends to be much more gradual. But what you should not see is a flat top. If you see a flat top, what that means is that there was additional utilization that would have happened if the capacity had been there for it, but it didn't. That's where you know that you should have released more capacity. If you're not seeing that, then, and there was only 17% growth, there are a lot of possible reasons why that might be. One thing to think about is whether there's been less downstream use that's somehow making up for the increased upstream use. One question is whether you're looking at peak values or average values, and whether there's been more use further into the evening. One thing that's been happening, of course, is people are traveling for work less. So they're not flying to a meeting and operating in that time zone anymore. They're having to take that meeting as a teleconference in whatever time zone other people are in. And so what you see is a sort of a flattening out of that curve and more use in the middle of the night, right? Whereas somebody might have had to fly halfway around the world to a conference before, now they're just going to be using a lot of bandwidth at 2 in the morning. So that also changes things. And if all you're looking at is peak values, that additional use in the middle of the night is not going to be measured in, whereas average values it will be. Do we have more questions? I see the open question queue is empty at the moment.
Empty at the moment. The one question that had come through at one point is, where is, and if you know, the OECD, how are they continuing this work you know, as the pandemic continues, and are there additional recommendations that will be getting made?
So I think the thought is that they're going to continue trying to update these papers, but that also they were going to try to do a few more specific papers on particular topics. As I said, the one on open source software is being debated. A lot of experts are chiming in. The problem there is that there is a huge division of opinion about what should happen between, say, the security experts on the one hand, and, for instance, lobbyists for Amazon AWS on the other hand, right? So AWS hosts a vast amount of the cloud services out there. If a bunch of governments come out with guidelines that say, well, you know, for these broad areas, cloud services are no longer a good idea, then AWS loses a lot of business. So naturally, AWS lobbies against that. They get the US government to go to bat for them. And they're just one of many providers in this space, Google and Cloudflare and Akamai and you know, Oracle. Many different companies are selling services that are hosted in the US and subject to US law globally, right? Selling those services globally, and are very glad that they don't have to respond to political and legal pressure in every country where they're doing business. Yet they're very happy to take money from those countries and take it back to the US. So this is something that you need to be thinking about from a policy perspective. And you can't look too much to the OECD and other intergovernmental organizations to come up with useful advice about that, because the very nature of intergovernmental organizations is that it's difficult for them to arrive at consensus and publish something if any one of the large members is significantly against it. And the US government is significantly against anything that would reduce the dominance of US tech companies in global markets.
Any other, just looking in the chat box, any other questions here as we wrap up? Okay. As we shared at the beginning of the program and throughout in the chat box, we will be sharing these slides. The presentation has been recorded, so we will have that as well for you. And if there are any additional questions that you have, please do pass them along to us, and we will do whatever we can to get you answers and connected to the resources that you may need as you're working and addressing these issues within your country. I want to again thank Bill and Nishal from Packet Clearinghouse for their work today. Bill, as you were going through with the presentation, Nishal was very busy in the question and answer section, addressing many of the issues that were raised in there. So significant thanks to both of you for the work that you put in, and to the AFRINIC team as well for all the work you did today, and also that you have done behind the scenes in the last several weeks to get us ready for today, to be able to come through and provide this session. And we look forward, as Bill shared at the beginning, to continuing this collaboration and continuing this series of discussions as we move through the next several months with our new normal, and that we also do look forward to hosting all of you back when we can in the United States for USTTI training with Packet Clearinghouse. So again, hope you have enjoyed today's session, that you have found it useful, and we do look forward to welcoming you back here again. So thank you, and have a great day.